Hello, and welcome to today's online Latino leader gathering on what is going on with Latino voters, faith, politics, and the Latino community in 2022. My name is Anna Gordon, and I'm the project manager for the Initiative on Catholic Social Thought and Public Life at Georgetown University. Our initiative regularly hosts discussions, always accompanied by food and drink when we can be in person, for young Latino Catholics and others to explore key issues and personal stories involving faith and public life with distinguished Latinos and other leaders. While we may not have food and drink with us tonight, we do have hundreds of young people tuned in, and we have a terrific panel of 5 Latino leaders to discuss some complex and important questions. Latinos in the United States are a very diverse group in terms of political affiliation, ideology, religion, economic background, and culture. Yet Hispanics are often lumped together as the Latino vote. Over the next hour, we'll try to understand what's been going on among Latino voters, what impact Latino voters might have ahead of the 2022 midterm elections, and challenge some narratives and conventional wisdom about Latinos in the United States. We'll hear from a respected researcher with data on Latino voters in recent elections. A Politico reporter will share her reporting, and we'll hear from 2 Latino leaders on the front lines of the Catholic Church and in local communities, and from a Notre Dame political scientist on what all this means. And finally, we'll explore how principles of Catholic social thought can help young Latinos engage in politics and vote as faithful citizens. Here's our outstanding panel. We have Luis Ricardo Fraga, who is the director of the Institute for Latino Studies at the University of Notre Dame and author of Latinos in the 2016 Election, Latino Resistance, and the Election of Donald Trump. Ana Gonzalez Barrera is a senior researcher at Pew Research Center and an expert on U.S. Hispanic population and immigration issues. Sabrina Rodriguez is a national political correspondent for Politico, where she covers immigration, U.S. elections, and Hispanic voters. Gabby Trejo is the executive director of Sacramento Area Congregations Together, or ACT. Sacramento ACT is an affiliate of Faith in Action and a member of PICO, California. And finally, Maria de Lourdes Valencia is the Associate Director of the Culture of Life Office in the Roman Catholic Diocese of San Diego, California. We've already received some questions for these leaders, and we invite you watching to send in your questions as well by using the email you see at the bottom of your screen. Please also share your thoughts on social media using the hashtag LatinoVote22 and by tagging GUCST Public Life on Twitter. Now we're going to begin our conversation with Ana Gonzalez Barrera of Pew Research Center. Ana, we're so glad you can join us. Pew is the most respected source of polling and analysis on faith and public life. Can you provide an overview of recent data and polling on Latino voters in the United States?
Sure, definitely. Thank you so much, Ana. Thank you for the invitation. Let me share a presentation I prepared, a short presentation. So this short presentation is just an overview of Latinos in the US and the Latino vote. So first of all, I want to show you how the population has grown in the US. This is all Latinos living in the US. In 2020, they reached a record 62 million Latinos living in the US. And as you can see just from the chart, every year we're very happy to write a new record number has been reached. And it's so remarkable that actually in the last decade, since 2010, most of the population growth in the US was due to the growth among Latinos rather than other groups. And this growth among Latinos obviously also gets reflected among Latino voters. It hasn't risen as fast because the 2 main sources of the growth among Latinos is 1, immigration, and not all immigrants are authorized to vote because many of them are not naturalized US citizens. And 2, it's US births, and not all Latinos are older than 18 and can vote. Actually, Latinos are one of the groups that are the youngest living in the US. So in 2020, we projected that a record number of 32 million Latinos were going to be able to vote in 2020, and this for the first time made them the largest minority group in the US, surpassing Black Americans for the first time in the voting population. However, historically, Latinos have not gone out and voted, so they are eligible to vote, many of them, but less than half end up casting a ballot on election day. In 2018, we saw a record turnout level. This was the last midterms, and a similar jump was seen in 2020. We don't have the last numbers for 2020, but the jump in the turnout rate was similar. However, they still lacked other groups. So about the 2020 presidential election, one of the reasons why Latinos tend to vote in lower levels, one of them is because they're so young. Young people tend to be less engaged in politics. Another thing is where we find Latinos. So the bigger populations of Latinos and where they have the most importance are states where they are not considered battleground states, such as California, Texas, or New Mexico. In this election, they had an important weight among the voters in two states that were considered battleground states, Florida and Arizona. And that's where we saw the most attention being paid to them, particularly in Florida. And one of the reasons why people were looking at Florida is because Latinos in general are majority of Mexican origin, but in Florida, Cuban Americans make up more of the Latino population there and the registered voters, and they tend to affiliate with the Republican Party. So overall, Latinos tend to be more leaning towards the Democrat Party, but about a 25% considers themselves or aligns themselves with the Republican Party. And this actually is a little bit different, not only by country of origin. So I already said Cubans are more likely to be Republican, but also by religion. So less than half of Latinos are Catholic, and Catholics tend to be or align themselves more with the Democratic Party. And so do people who are unaffiliated, Latinos who are not affiliated with any major religion. But those who are Protestant, particularly who are evangelical, are more likely to align themselves with the Republican Party. And prior to the election, we did some polling, and we saw that Latinos, the most important topics for them for the election was the economy, healthcare, how well the issue of the coronavirus outbreak was being handled by the government, but also they were more likely to care about racial and ethnic inequality, for example. And in terms of the turnout rates, so these are the outcomes of the election, and this is based in our own data from validated voters. We saw a jump in the number or the share of Hispanic voters that voted for Trump compared to the 2016 election. In 2016, 28% voted for Trump. In 2020, it was 38%, so a jump of 10% points. However, Biden still got the majority of the Latino vote with almost 60% of the votes going for him. So this is something that was a misconception that many people thought Trump, because he had lost some of its approval, job approval, he was also going to gain less of the share of the voting population, but he actually made inroads among Latinos. And another thing we saw is that even though there was a high turnout rate among Latinos in 2020, they made up the same share among the voters in 2016 as they did in 2020. That means that the jump among the turnout or in the turnout of Latinos was just the same among other groups. So they made up 10% of the voters, just the same as they did in 2016. And they made an even larger share of those that did not vote. They ended up being 20% of those who did not vote. So still, they are lagging behind quite a bit from other groups. So just some key concepts is that they're not a monolithic group. About 38% of them voted for Trump in the last election, but it's a population that has been growing, and every year we see them reaching new levels with more people joining the Latino electorate by turning 18 or naturalizing. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Anna, for that important context. We'll come back to you when we get to audience questions to explore this in more detail. But now let me turn to our remaining panelists and continue the conversation. I'm going to ask each of you the same question. We'll begin with you, Sabrina. What is one misunderstood or surprising thing about the Latino vote? And thanks for joining us.
Yeah, thanks for having me. I will say, I think Anna touched on a lot of what is misunderstood and really hitting at a lot of the points I think are critical to understanding Latino voters. I cannot emphasize enough that Latinos are not a monolith. If I had $1 for every time that I feel like I have to say that, or I hear folks that are focused on Latino voters say that, I would be very rich. So I think it's something that, we have to really emphasize here. I think one thing that is very misunderstood is that all Latinos, when we're saying that not a monolith, what does that mean? And it's looking at what moves Latino voters to vote. Oftentimes it's this mythical, all Latino voters care about is immigration. And you see it with both parties, with Republican Party talking to Latino voters, or Democrats in particular talking to Latino voters saying, we're focused on immigration, we're focused on helping immigrants. But while that is a move, that is an issue that matters to many Latinos, it's not the only one. So when people go to fill out their ballot, that is not just it. It is the same issues that other groups of Americans are focused on, whether it is the economy, it is healthcare, it is education, it is safety. Many of these other issues are as important or more important when we're talking about Latino voters. So I think it's moving past this idea of the mythical Latino and that all Latino voters in California and Florida and Texas think the same or have the same priorities, but just thinking about how if any random person in New York worries about one issue, you could think of a completely different issue that people care about in Texas.
Gabby, what for you is the one misunderstood or surprising thing about the Latino vote?
Thank you again for having me. And I agree with Sabrina and Anna that at least in Sacramento, being at the capital of a very powerful state like California, that the number one misconception is that Latinos only are a single issue community and that immigration is like the road to our hearts. And when I think about even my own experience as an immigrant woman in this country, and I think about why my parents came to this country, it was for a better future for me. And they sacrificed everything that they ever had to immigrate into this country. And so when I think about what moves them as my parents to be voters now that they are able to vote, it is definitely looking at other issues that are so intersectional with other communities in our neighborhoods.
Thanks, Gabby. Maria, what for you is one misunderstood or surprising thing about the Latino vote?
Thank you. Showing that more and more Latinos are voting now is encouraging. But some analysis surprisingly show that Latino Catholics consider their conscience to vote. A conscience guided by their Catholic beliefs and value. And I'm talking about Catholic Latinos because I work with them, right? So that's my what I know. But they to vote, they consider their conscience. They follow their conscience, and their conscience is guided again by their Catholic beliefs and values. So if they have a good conscience, which requires a lifelong formation, they will be considered the principle of the human life and dignity, solidarity, and the common good when they vote. They will select candidates and policies that represent their principles. However, other Latinos Catholics are moved by their own personal interests when they vote, and others just prefer to stay, in the spectator role. So it's incredible to know that, even though they are not very, involved in politics, but they follow their conscience. which is good. I mean, if it is a good conscience, right? A formed conscience.
Thanks, Maria. And Luis, what is one misunderstood or surprising thing about the Latino vote for you?
What I think not everyone knows is that if you average out Republican support from Latinos in presidential elections, for example, going back to 1972, approximately 28.4% of Latinos vote for any Republican presidential candidate. So although it's important to say it's not a monolithic vote, it's never been a monolithic vote. And the baseline that one has to use to understand decline of Democratic support and increase in Republican support, and the reverse, if that happens in the election, is that you're starting from particular baselines that are different. So if the Latino vote for Republicans, such as in the last election, depending upon which exit poll you believe has it right, and the issues associated with sampling and sampling design and so forth, if Trump received 32% overall of the Latino vote, that's just a few percentage points above, this is in 2020, what you would normally expect. That is that 28.4%. This varies by national origin group. It varies by state because of the concentration of national origin groups in different places. But it's very important to understand what that baseline of Republican and Democratic support is. It's one that is overwhelmingly, I would say, Democrat, not 90% like African Americans, but still very strongly Democrat. And then you see what the changes are from those percentages.
That's very helpful and a great way to frame our conversation going forward. Let me just quickly remind everyone watching to submit your questions for these panelists using the email that you see at the bottom of your screen. And Sabrina, let me come back to you. I just have to say, I love your Twitter bio. It's one of the best I've read. And it says on your bio, among other things, that you're a Cubanita de Hialeah and a member of the National Association of Hispanic Journalists. And as a journalist for Politico, you've been reporting on Hispanic voters for years. And recently, you've written on how Latino voting patterns are shifting ahead of the 22 midterm elections. You've noted that there's a growing Hispanic Republican population, like we've been talking about, while the Democratic Party continues to neglect and disregard Hispanic voters. What is your analysis of the 2020 presidential election results? How did Latinos vote in that election? And what does that mean for this year's midterms and for the 2024 presidential race?
I will start with saying I think it's a really important thing to keep in mind what Luis was saying. It is not unprecedented that there are Latinos that vote Republican. And I think that after the 2020 election, I myself as a journalist have had to navigate this. How much alarm do we put on this? How much focus do we put on this? Because it is not unprecedented. And especially being from South Florida, being Cuban American, for me, it's like, okay, yes, there are Republicans that are Latinos. What a shock. So I think that is an important frame to go into it. Now, the question here, though, is, there has been such a focus on the future of the Democratic Party being more focused on voters of color. So if we see the Republican Party making more inroads with Latinos, that disrupts that path to victory and that future for the Democratic Party. Even if we're talking about 4 percentage points, or if we're talking about 8 percentage points, there's not a question when we're talking about 2022 or 2024, or I would say even the next 10 to 20 years. I don't think there is this perception that, the Democratic Party is suddenly going to lose a majority of Latino voters. By no means. They have that on lock for the medium-term future, I would go as far as saying. But it's a question now of seeing how both parties are courting Latino voters in a way that hadn't been done in the past. There has been in past election cycles this sort of expectation of, okay, well, Latinos vote Democrat, the majority, and Republicans will get that, small percentage they get, and they have that on lock, and it's fine. Now, after seeing in 2020 the results, we're seeing the Republican Party and Republican groups making a more conscientious effort to go out and try and build on that, which means Democrats have to work harder. Democrats have to show up in places that they haven't historically done that. We're talking, for example, one area that was talked a lot about outside of South Florida. So I'm not going to focus on all the Cubans, I promise, but is in South Texas. That is majority Mexican American and majority Tejanos for many generations in Texas, and seeing what's happened there. For example, we have the Republican Party opening up these, I air quote them, they're called community centers, where they're trying to engage more with Latino voters. Seeing that type of focus there really is forcing the Democratic Party to invest more, to show up, to say, you've been loyal Democratic voters, here's why you should stay loyal. And that's really a lot of what I'm paying attention to this year.
That's great. Let's return to what you said about courting Latino voters, and let's get more specific, more concrete. From your reporting, what is going on, what's the same, and what's changing on both Democratic and Republican outreach on topics like faith, immigration, abortion, COVID, and crime? What is the current context?
Well, I will say, a lot of things have stayed the same. So in terms of what the Democratic Party stands for at the end of the day is the same. A lot of what the Republican Party stands for has stayed the same. But in terms of, and I come at it obviously from the side of a reporter, and what I have seen other reporters covering is, in 2020, for example, as well, we saw a lot of focus on Latino evangelicals and the fact that, that is part of where, for example, Trump made inroads, because they made a very conscientious effort to focus on them, where, for example, on the issue of abortion, they could sway more voters that were really focused on that. And that was a big priority. Even to South Texas, where I was talking about, I recently did a story about, Hispanic GOP women that are really out canvassing and trying to get more people on board. And one of the issues that they're the most focused on is the issue of abortion, because they know there are many people that care about that. But the issues that we see that are really the same here is the question of getting that message out. And there's often been a feeling within the Democratic Party, Latinos that are involved, that everyone shows up for them at the last minute, where it won't be until August and September that they'll see ads targeting them, or it won't be until August and September that people are showing up at their door knocking and, trying to court their vote. So now we're starting to see some of that start early, where that's where it gets interesting to see, really, will people be swayed? Or people, have high approval of the president, or will it track with a lot of the national trends we're seeing more broadly?
Thanks, Sabrina. Gabby, let's come to you. You lead Sacramento ACT, a community organization, which is, like I said, a member of PICO, California, and an affiliate of the national network Faith in Action. And Sacramento ACT does such important work. I was looking on your website and you were telling me you provide hotlines and know your rights trainings for immigrants. You provide youth with mental health services. You work to create affordable housing. You're organizing around environmental justice concerns. The list goes on. Tell us about your work and the people you organize with in the Sacramento area. What are the policies and issues that the Latinos you work with, what do they care about?
Well, I would say that the folks I mostly organize within the Catholic Church. And so we're organizing mostly Latino immigrants, Mexican Americans, young people. And I would say that on top of all the issues that we have identified as a community is really this fight for freedom of being recognized as children of God, to be recognized as with our full dignity. And that takes us on this pathway to fight for housing. When the pandemic started, or the summer of 2020, we started doing what we called in community organizing a listening campaign, and talked to over 300 residents, Latino residents, and asked, like, what are some of the anxieties that they were facing? And housing was the number one issue, that the anxiety around, like, not knowing if they were going to be able to keep their jobs, and then safety, right? Like for our undocumented immigrant leaders, they were concerned that they weren't going to be able to receive help from the federal government to help support them get through this pandemic. And so our folks decided that we weren't going to wait for the city or the county or the state to come and save us. So they decided that we were going to take it upon ourselves, raise money to help support undocumented immigrants in our region, to ensure that we can help them pay for their rent. And so I would say that all the issues that we've taken on, from bringing healthcare coverage to undocumented immigrants in this region in Sacramento, have been very much driven by this appetite to claim their identity of who God created them to be, and their contributions to this region. And so in 2016, we were able to win a fight to bring healthcare coverage to undocumented immigrants. And I'm really proud to say that actually came from one of our leaders who was involved in a state fight to bring driver's licenses to undocumented immigrants in California. And she said, Gabby, how come when I went to get my driver's license, I can say that I could become an organ donor, but I can't have access to healthcare? And that was, to me, like one of those questions that just broke my heart, because I didn't have an answer. I was like, that is a moral contradiction. And so we just started meeting with local elected officials and started pushing. And we're just really proud to say that all the wins that we've accomplished at the local level, from housing to healthcare to driver's license, have been very driven in this appetite to be seen as children of God in our respected communities.
That's terrific. And it sounds like you are stepping up for the people in this community. But how have Latinos in the United States, and maybe especially in Sacramento, been courted and ignored by politicians, political party leaders, and faith communities even? And what can young Latinos do to engage and persuade and to shape these political debates to make a difference?
Well, I would say that, Latinos we've been shaping, right, like our local narratives, and have continued to work in that way. I wish I could say that I have seen more courting of our people, right? The reality is that I have experienced in my field our community being reached as an aftermath. And when we, as an organization, think about mobilizing and getting out the vote of low propensity voters, that actually requires that elected officials, that politicians go out and engage people where they are at. And so using the voter registration like phone list is not enough, because that doesn't generate an accurate list of where our people are. And so I think young people have the opportunity to really make the demands of and shape the future of how they want to be addressed by electeds, by institutions, to really shape that narrative that we do matter, and that if you want my vote, you need to meet me and listen to the concerns that I have, and you need to have a plan for how you're going to address these issues. I think independently of people's of the political parties that people are associated with, young people care about living in healthy communities and being able to thrive, to have access to education, to be able to take part on the benefiting from the different investments that are happening in our local community. And so making sure that happens at every level, from institutions to local leaders, local government, young people can make sure that they push to make sure that their vote, when they're casting their vote, that they're thinking also about how their vote is going to benefit a larger community, not just us as individuals.
Maria, you are just down at the other end of California in San Diego, and you're part of the Culture of Life office in the Diocese of San Diego, where you defend and promote human life and dignity from conception to natural death. You have a passion for serving the church, especially young adults. You helped plan and coordinate the Fifth Encuentro, which is a multi-year effort to listen and discern the best ways to respond to Latino Catholics in the United States. And you were involved in both the 2016 Synod on the Family and the 2019 Synod on Young People. You're very busy. Tell us about the Latino Catholics you meet in your work in San Diego. What are policies and issues that the Catholics you meet care about?
So I work with parish leaders most of the time, and the majority of them are very active in their parishes, right? But only a few of them are really interested in advocacy and public policy. For instance, in the Encuentro, the Quinto Encuentro, which was a gathering of Latino discern ways in which the church in the United States can better respond to their needs. So 86 delegates representing San Diego participated in the post-encuentro. They had to select a ministerial area, and only 9 out of the 86 selected the social justice area. Others selected in the areas of evangelization, education, leadership, development, and family. Those who participated in the social justice area were concerned about immigration, specifically about DACA, because there were a lot of young adults. So night of San Diego, but we were in a all the diocese were there. It was a nationwide gathering. But anyways, so they were concerned about DACA, poverty, abortion, and climate change. They expressed the need to form parish leaders on Catholic social teaching, and the need of creating programs and events to put their faith in action and receive Catholic education on Catholic social teaching. So that's what they concern most of the Catholics, Latino Catholics here in San Diego, specifically when we meet in the Encuentro.
That's really interesting to hear. So in your office, you bring together issues of human life and dignity, like topics like abortion, immigration, the death penalty, climate change, and poverty, like you were just mentioning. How does supporting these broad range of issues fit into the current political climate that is so polarized? Do Latinos have a natural political home in the Democratic Party or the Republican Party based on your experience? And finally, how can principles of Catholic social thought create a path forward for diverse Latino communities to engage in U.S. politics and vote as faithful citizens?
Well, I don't think we live in a world of polarization, right? So we have bishops that are conservative, others that are progressive, or liberals. In my own family, I have young adults that. My 4 young adults, some of them are, pro-choice, and others are pro-abortion. Pro-life, and also with the leaders I work with, even if they are working in the culture of life or respect life ministry, they have their own call. Some of them work to defend the unborn, or defend the environment, or defend the life of those who are sick and those who are at the end of life. So they have their own call. However, my job is to promote education, specifically to promote education on Catholic social teaching, and also to create awareness that even if we have been called to work in a specific ministry, we have the common ground, and the common ground is the principle of protection, life, and human dignity. And from that principle, we have other principles, right? But that's our core of Catholic social teaching. So that's what I always tell them. We have to, I respect what you think and what you believe. That's great, but we have to understand other point of views, right? So again, what is the other question?
No, I think you answered it perfectly. Thank you so
Okay.
much. And we'll come back to all of you. We're getting lots of questions in. But finally, let me come to you, Luis. You have many impressive titles at the University of Notre Dame. You are the Reverend Donald P. McNeil Professor of Transformative Latino Leadership, the Joseph and Elizabeth Robbie Professor of Political Science, the Director of the Institute for Latino Studies, and a fellow at the Institute for Educational Initiatives. You've spent your career researching and teaching on Latino politics, the politics of race and ethnicity, voting rights policy, as well as immigration and education policy. You recently edited a major book on Latinos in the 2016 election, which we mentioned earlier. Can you tell us, based on that book, what happened in the 2016 election and in 2020, and what does that mean for the future?
Well, certainly with regards to Latino voters, the preference for the Democrat was still apparent in 2016. It represented more or less the same percentages that one would anticipate given what previous levels were. 2020 was a little different, mainly because of two states, Florida and South Texas. If you look at those two areas, the Republican support was much more significant than it had been in 2016. And people often suggest that this was unexpected. And I think that's fair. I think it was perhaps more expected in Florida, given the way in which Trump campaigned in 2020 in Florida, especially the emphasis on socialism and communism and the way that represented a lot of fear, or at least encouraged further fear on the part of some voters, Cubans, Venezuelans, and others. And in South Texas, I think, is where there was the greatest surprise. But one has to remember that areas of South Texas also deal with the unexpected detrimental consequences of immigration to a substantial degree. And so issues related to immigration and the border become, I think, more significant in areas like that. But the other things that we learned from the 2016 election, and I hope we can have a conference and look at the 2020 election, is that you can't expect Latino preferences to necessarily follow growth in the Latino vote. You always have to understand the Latino vote, whatever the distribution of preferences is, the Latino Republican vote and the Latino Democratic vote, so to speak, and that's the way I like to refer to it, relative to how other segments of the population vote. That is, how are African Americans voting? What's their population distribution in a particular state? How are whites voting? What's their population distribution in another state? For example, if all Latinos in Texas voted for the Democratic candidate, the Republican candidate would still win because there's such a solid white Republican vote. Different in Florida, a little different in Florida, certainly different in California. So we have to be analytically nimble in understanding what difference Latino voters and the increase in Latino voters might or might not make.
I have more questions for you, Luis, but I just wonder, Sabrina, if you would like to offer just a quick reaction to those comments. Did you see that in your reporting, that the GOP results that he was talking about in Florida and South Texas resulting from those causes?
Yeah, I mean, absolutely. When we're looking in South Florida and South Texas, I mean, these are some of the common patterns that we saw in 2020. I think everyone kind of wanted a one size fits all for South Texas and one for South Florida, and or writing it off as just Cubans or just but I mean, these are some of the patterns that we did see in 2020 and have been part of the discussions, I would say, since the election.
Yes, thank you for that. Luis, I'll come back to you now. At a time when the number of U.S. Latino Protestants and Catholics continues to grow while other religious groups appear to be declining, and there's this growing population of nuns, what does this mean for future elections in the United States? How have political candidates, parties, and leaders engaged or not engaged with Latino voters?
Those are two separate questions. One, with regards to Catholic voters and what impact Latino Catholics, what patterns we see in Latino Catholic voting. As Maria said, you have traditionalists and you have progressives, as you do among Catholics generally. And traditionalists tend to be guided more by issues associated with reproductive rights and gay marriage, and those tend to be the main ones. The question is, are those the reasons voters, even traditionalist voters, vote that way? So you can have positions on issues, but they're not necessarily determinative of your vote. So one has to always be aware that although there may be groups that have particular positions, is that sufficient to push them to vote for a particular candidate? And what I found in my research is sometimes yes, and sometimes no. Depends on who the candidates are, what the issues are in the particular election. It's very important also to distinguish between what Latinos say is most important for the country as a whole or for them generally versus what do you think is the most important issue confronting Latino communities. When you ask the question that way, you tend to get immigration rise much more to the top, even among second, third, and fourth generation Latinos. And your second question, Anna, was about, remind me?
How have political candidates
Yes.
and parties and leaders engaged or not engaged with Latino voters?
Very good. Short-term memory is one of the first things to go when you get older. Traditionally, both Republican and Democratic candidates and parties target active voters, voters that have a history of participating in elections. When you have scarce resources, you invest where you think you're going to get the greatest return on your investment. Mobilizing non-participatory voters, which sizable numbers of Latinos are, mobilizing them, contacting them, registering them, costs more money. And there's a need, therefore, for folks to focus more on what difference mobilizing traditionally unmobilized voters can be. That represents, I think, a different vision, a very different vision of what the challenges are to both parties. So it's not so much a factor of trying to switch people's votes. It's a factor of, or an emphasis on, trying to garner greater support among these individuals who are not registered to vote or are not contacted, since studies have shown for years that Latinos have among the lowest contact rates, even during presidential elections, by both Democratic and Republican candidates. Republicans did a much better job this time. The Obama campaign seemed to do a much better job when he was running for president. And so this is going to vary a bit depending upon who the candidate is and what the strategy is of the particular party.
Thanks so much for that, Luis. We are coming, I can't believe we're already almost at the end of our time together, and we've received so many questions, and I'd like to start turning to those. Gabby, I wonder if I could ask you this question that's come in about COVID, about the COVID-19 pandemic. How do concerns about COVID affect Latino attitudes and votes? Things related to COVID, like essential workers, schools, the risks of COVID, the costs, wearing masks. Could you tell us a little bit about what you've heard with the people you work with?
Yeah, one of the areas that we have heard leaders share, Latino leaders in Sacramento share their, just like the risk that undocumented immigrants who had to come out and be essential workers and risk their lives, right? Like how to access resources for them, right? That has been a big piece. And then the other area actually has been around the schools and resources for parents. We have a group of parents that have been organizing around education. And 2 years ago, they came out of like fighting the school district to keep 6 schools open. And they're like, but I don't know how to like help my kid through this virtual, school. So it was a stress of not actually being able to support their students while they work virtually. And now sharing concerns around what is it that, how is it that they can help their students get to the reading levels that they need to be, right? And so they have been organizing to make sure that our school districts bring more tutoring and resources that they can access, especially knowing that school districts are getting a lot of funding for COVID relief for this particular issue.
I wonder, Anna, if I can come back to you on the COVID question, if you have anything to say on that. But I wonder maybe if we could go to another question while Anna's looking at her notes. What are the disconnects of the parties to Latinos who care about faith, community, and families? Another way of thinking of that is the cultural agenda of Democrats and the anti-immigrant agenda of Trump and the GOP. Luis, do you have any thoughts on that, or Sabrina? Maybe Luis first.
Okay. Yes, I do. There is a difficult balancing that, for example, Latino Catholics or evangelicals even have to reach between a commitment to social justice and issues related to reproductive rights. And what the right balance should be is very difficult. And of course, the guidance we get from the USCCB, the United States Conference of Catholic Bishops, is that each person needs to decide upon their own, as was said before, according to their own conscience, and has to make a decision in that way. So it would be nice to say things line up neatly, but candidates rarely do. And certainly parties rarely line up neatly, either as traditional or as progressive. And so it becomes then a balancing act, as I said before, for voters to then decide which candidate they think may best serve their particular interests. For some Catholic voters, the issue is reproductive rights. For others, it's social justice issues, like those related to COVID and things of that sort, right? Or immigration. For some evangelical voters, increasing numbers of evangelical voters, social justice issues and immigration are very important to them. It's not just, especially Latino evangelicals, it's not just the issue of reproductive rights. So again, there's a balancing that each of these voters has to make, and candidates have to decide which positions they're going to take.
Sabrina, do you have anything to add to that? What are the disconnects of the parties when Latinos care so deeply about faith, community, and family?
Yeah, I mean, what I can add here is from conversations with voters. It's not just how candidates are positioning themselves, but ultimately, if you like someone, you are predisposed to accept what they're doing. If they have compelling ads, if they have come to your community multiple times to speak to you, if you live in a neighborhood where many people are supporting that candidate, or, you know, a local community leader is supporting them and is canvassing in your neighborhood. So in conversations with voters, and I've had plenty with Catholic voters in South Florida in particular, and in the area in Hialeah where I grew up, it kind of plays out differently. And I'll use Hialeah as this example that is often, you know, touted as this conservative leaning, Republican leaning city outside of Miami. But under the Obama years in 2008, 2012, which I feel like people feel was so far away, but is not that far away. Hialeah was almost 50-50 Democrat and Republican at that point. So it's not an unheard of phenomenon and not that long ago. And talking to voters that may have voted for Obama in 2012, they'll tell you that, you know, for them, it meant a lot historically to have a black president, or that the way he talked about social justice issues was compelling for them and meant moving forward, or the way he talked about the situation in Cuba and the things he wanted to do for the Cuban people and this type of compassion for the Cuban people was what drove them to vote for him. Then when we talk about 2016 or 2020, you could hear some of the folks that flipped saying almost the opposite of how Donald Trump came so many times and talked about how he cared about the Cuban people, and how he came so many times and talked about the plight of, you know, Cuban families that have been separated because of communism and such. And for some of them, it was weighing what mattered to them more. And again, it's not neat whatsoever. You can speak to folks where you say, okay, but on this issue, you completely disagree with Trump. How do you love Trump then? And they'll give you 5 other reasons why they do. And sometimes it's not even a policy question. It's he's a strong businessman and he knows what to do with the economy. And then when people talk like that, it becomes even harder to rationalize if it's not, grounded in a policy or a specific position.
Absolutely. Anna, I want to come back to you. The pandemic has been such a large part of everyone's life over the past 2 years. What can you tell us about concerns about COVID affecting Latino attitudes and votes?
Yeah, so what we saw in general during the pandemic was that Latinos were more affected by the pandemic in terms of getting COVID themselves or somebody in their family, and also having lost income due to the pandemic. So either because they lost a job or because somebody in their family had to cut back on wages or something similar. So we definitely saw that during the campaign, the management of COVID and healthcare were 2 of the main topics in people's minds, reflecting that they were thinking about during the election. And we saw that so Latinos were more affected financially, and the economy was the number 1 topic for them. So definitely, I think the voters had it in mind, all of that, the effects of the pandemic and the management of the pandemic when they casted their ballots. But we did see an increase in the share that voted for Trump. So we could just imagine what that had to do with the pandemic or not. It's mere speculation, really.
Well, and it's just helpful to remember that we've all been impacted by this pandemic, but others have been impacted more severely. Maria, I'd love to come to you with a question that we received. Just very broadly, what does faith have to do with everything we've been talking about? And specifically, what is the message of Pope Francis about all of this? He's the first Latino Pope, and here we are talking about Latino voters in the United States. What do you think Pope Francis' message is?
So Pope Francis encouraged dialogue, right? Dialogue with people that not necessarily are agree with our principles of our belief. So he encouraged communication and constant dialogue with them. And then he also talks about an encounter, right? We have to encounter and accompany those who are suffering and those who are, with the most vulnerable. And he tells us constantly about that culture of encounter and accompanying people and be open to listen and go to the peripheries. That means that I have to leave my comfort zone and go and see what is the reality out there, right? People suffering, people that really needs help, that really are, upset about injustice. And we have to respond to that. And he responds in a very pastoral and pacific and lovely way. He responds. He wants us to respond to that need that is in there.
He's all about dialogue. Absolutely. Gabby, what do you think Pope Francis's message is to us in the United States?
Well, I think Pope Francis has given us a blueprint of what to do. And in the first chapter of Joy of the Gospel, he talks about wanting this church that is bruised and comes out of the 4 walls of the church. And that's what I think community organizing does to the faith community. It brings us close to God, to encounter God in others, and to smell like the sheep. Because one day, for me as a Catholic woman, I know God will ask me, where's your brother? Where's your sister? And I want to be able to answer that. And I think the more that young people and people of faith engage in reflecting, how do we live our faith in a very active way? I think that's one of the ways in which Pope Francis encouraged us to pose that question for ourselves and be active.
We're just getting another question in here, and I'd like to pose it to Sabrina, if you're comfortable answering it. How do political parties use or misuse language with Hispanic voters, using terms like Latino, Hispanic, Latinx, people of color? Can you talk a little bit about that?
Yes. This is one of those issues that every few months I end up having to write about, and every few months I hope that it's the last time I have to write about it. But unfortunately, that is not the case. So it is a good question that keeps coming up. Being in the media, and I don't want to be critical of the media, but there's been an outsized focus on the word Latinx and how much Democrats use it, how much progressives use it, whether it is a term that Latinos or Hispanics identify with. The reality is there's been poll after poll that shows that it is widely unpopular, that only about 2% of people that identify as Hispanic or Latino, which is important that there is a distinction here because not all Hispanics are Latino. So that if we're going to get in the technicalities of the definitions, they're not the same. But when we're talking about Latinx specifically, it is widely unpopular. There have been multiple polls and multiple surveys that have been done that show that a good chunk of it's about 40% was in the latest polling that was about it. About 40% of Latinos are less likely to support a candidate, a political candidate that uses the term Latinx to describe them. Now, the reality is that Latinx was not created as this all-encompassing term, and there's a lot of misconceptions about where it comes from and this idea that it came from white liberals imposing it on Latinos. That is not the case. It has come from within the community. Many queer Latino activists in the United States adopted this term, came up with this term to be more inclusive when we're talking about Latinos of all, identifications. So, and we also have seen it within Latin America that the use of the X has been used when we're trying to create a more gender neutral language or phrasing. So that's on Latinx. And then on Hispanic and Latino, I would say, one of the things that I hear time and time again from, Latino consultants that are, talking to candidates themselves is saying, use what people are most comfortable with. So for example, if I'm talking to, and I do it too in my own job, is if I'm talking to people in California, I don't use Hispanic, I use Latino because that tends to be more commonly used. I would say Latinos. If I'm in South Florida, you don't necessarily say Latino all the time, it'll be Hispanic. So it really varies depending on where you are. And just understanding that not everyone identifies the same way. Some people also will say that they don't want to say Latino or Hispanic, they want to say their country of origin. So it really does vary from region to region and person to person.
I have a related question, and this will be our last one, and then we'll wrap up. And I wonder, Luis, maybe I could come to you on this. There's this question that says, when racial justice and racism are discussed by many politicians, journalists, advocates, Latinos are left out. America's race problem is seen as literally in black and white and not brown. How can we address systemic racism and the legacy of slavery without leaving out Latino history?
Well, I've been very pleased with the extent to which the media and political leaders, including African-American leaders, have tended to use the terms black and brown, have tended to include both groups when their positions are similar. This is with regards to the excessive use of force by police, with regards to voter suppression efforts. It's much more common. It was much less common 10 years ago. And I'm pleased with the progress that has been made. California is not New York, it's not, Michigan is not Florida, so it varies a bit by state, if not varies a lot by state. But I think Latinos more and more are entering into the realm of our public discourse. And when appropriate, they are put together with African Americans. And when they're not, they're looked at separately. If it's data, Latinos usually fall somewhere between blacks and whites regarding educational attainment and a variety of other things. So I'm very pleased with how much progress has been made, but we need to still make much more. but we need to be smart about when we link different groups to one another.
Thanks for that. We're already at the end of our time together. So as we conclude this gathering, I want to ask all of our panelists for one quick closing comment. And Maria, I'll come to you first. We have so many young Latinos who are listening in, young adults. What is one thing that all of our viewers can do to act on what we've discussed over the past hour? Maria?
Yes. So according to U.S. Catholic bishops, in the Catholic social tradition, responsible citizenship is a virtue and participation in political life is a moral obligation. This obligation is rooted in our baptism commitment to follow Jesus and to be Christian witness in all we do. The bishops recommend to listen to your conscience and to vote with prudence for candidates and policies that support human life, family, religion, liberty, solidarity, and subsidiarity, and the protection of the poor. Also, in order to make this wise decision, you have to be informed. You need to help. You will help also. If you are informed, you can also help and educate your family and friends. And I encourage you to dream big and believe that social change is possible. If we work together, we can make it happen. So keep working and keep hoping.
Thank you. Luis, what is one action step that people can take?
For young Latinos, register to vote. Register, register, register. I know we've been doing that for upwards of 40 years, but we're still among the least registered with Asian Americans. And as our population grows, our registration disparity with African Americans and whites grows as well. Notice the counterintuitive consequence, right? The gap, if you will, grows. About 800,000 Latinos turn 18 every year. And 94% of all Latinos under the age of 18 are born in the United States. 94%. So the next generation of political activists and potential voters and so forth are already American citizens, not everybody by any means. But 94%, at least 94% are, and that means that they have to be given the opportunity to grow in their political knowledge, but they also have to be pushed to exercise those responsibilities, as Maria said, responsibly and consistent with what they understand their social obligations to be and their religious obligations to be. That, I think, will be a key. Organizing by parishes, I think, is something that is still far too underdeveloped, not for a particular candidate, not for a particular party, but for civic engagement generally.
Sabrina, what's one thing our viewers can do to act on what we've discussed?
I cannot reiterate and emphasize enough registering to vote and actually going out to vote. I am so tired of hearing about Latinos not being part of the persuadable voter universe, and that being why, people make the calculus to not invest in trying to draw out Latino voters. And that changes by Latinos going out to vote. So I cannot emphasize that enough, so we can continue to have rich stories of just the diversity of the Latino community.
Great. And finally, Gabby, what's one thing people watching can do to act on what they've heard this past hour?
I just want to encourage people to learn more about faith-based community organizing. We are the best kept secret of the church. There are people like you who are putting their efforts together to be architects of their future, of their community's future. And so your diocese is very likely to have a community organizing entity as part of their Catholic social teaching. So I encourage you to learn more about faith-based organizing.
Great. And I just want to say thank you especially to Ana Gonzalez Barrera for providing that incredibly helpful data and framework for this conversation. You set us off on the right pace at the top of the hour. We're already done with our time together, so I just want to thank Luis, Ana, Sabrina, Gabby, and Maria, and all of you watching. Thank you for joining us. This is just a reminder that this discussion will be recorded and posted on our website and social media channels for later viewing. And you can also see follow-up resources from all these panelists posted on our website as well. Thanks to everyone who helped us on the technical end of this dialogue, and a special thanks to my colleagues at the initiative, John Carr and Kim Daniels, for their efforts to put this conversation together. Finally, please join me in thanking once again these 5 leaders who have informed us and inspired us: Luis Fraga, Ana Gonzalez Barrera, Sabrina Rodriguez, Gabby Trejo, and Maria Lourdes de Valencia. Thank you so much.